Hi, I'm Mike Coyle, and you're watching Inside Exploration. Today I'm here with Enrico Di Cesare, the president of NSGI Technologies. So Enrico, thanks for coming back and talking to me today.
Nice to be here, Mike.
I wanted to talk to you today about some of the work that you've done. So maybe just give us a bit of an overview of what NSGI is, and then we'll kind of branch out into some other areas.
Yeah, so NSGI got created way back as a side shoot of 20 years of trying to find transformation technology for the iron and steel industry on the North Shore. As you may know, we only ship pellets or concentrates around the world from there. And that started with the city of Sept-Îles and people from Quebec, and we were working, and eventually it turned into our own IP, which we put into NSGI Steel.
So what technologies are you working on with NSGI? I know it was mainly in the iron industry, but you also have some TiO2 stuff, but talk to us about the steel stuff first.
Yeah, so it started out as 100% pig iron, and honestly, no one even considered that it could be used for ferroalloys. That was more recent discussions with people looking at ferronickel initiated us to look at, would this work? And it was, I think it does. We did the tests. Now we think it's actually a new, let's call it cookie cutter or bread maker for the ferroalloy industry, as well as the pig iron industry or the steel industry, the conventional carbon steel. So we think it's an actual complement to stainless steel as well. That's how the evolution happened. Then we started to do comparisons with CapEx, OpEx. We of course are forced to look at CO2 these days. Everybody's bad word is CO2. So how it was done was we actually did a comparison to best in class, looking at CO2 from the North Shore to the majority of the ore goes to China, for example. What is the total CO2 impact worldwide? Because as you know, you can't just say the CO2 emitted in China doesn't count, or the CO2 emitted in Europe doesn't count, and it's not in my backyard. Well, it's in everybody's backyard, right? So we did that, and we compared sinter feed, pellet feed. So for example, 2.1 tons of CO2 for sinter feed globally, including transport, 1.9 tons of CO2 globally again for pellet feed. And then we did the same exercise for the ferronickel industry. And we compared what the largest producer in China does with a blast furnace. We also compared what's being done in Indonesia. Everybody reads the reports about them coming online with the next generation of battery grade nickel. And today they're one of the leaders in stainless steel. And that is even more impactful because in general, those types of ores are 4 to 6 tons of CO2 per ton of ferronickel.
Oh, wow.
And that's when we started looking at, could we do something more interesting and in a different way if it was done in Quebec with a local ore. So just to put it in perspective, we believe we'll be at 0.3 tons negative per ton of ferronickel with one of the approaches.
Part of that approach is your furnace. So you've designed an electric furnace. Can you kind of talk a bit about how that works and how it differs from current technologies?
So what we did was we took all of what's best in a blast furnace, and the image that we have of the steel industry being dirty mainly comes from coke making. You end up with tars. The things you don't see are the carcinogens and things like that that come out of it. But there's inefficiencies if you need coke, the size. The other part of it is we took a self-reducing briquette and we combined all of that. So what we really did was redesign the furnace in a more efficient way, lower CapEx, lower OpEx, and eliminate the need for coke. Initially, that was good enough. But today we realize we can actually even use biomass if it's available in sufficient quantities.
Hmm.
I'd be lying to you if I said I'm going to make 1 million tons of pig iron on biomass. I mean, that's a huge quantity of biomass.
Yeah.
But for ferroalloys, most of them are smaller capacities, and that we can do with biomass. So, everybody's gone to the internet today. So the pulp and paper industry is having a hard time. Many of them are closing, but that doesn't mean that wood or that raw material cannot be used for something strategic like ferroalloys. So that was where the thinking started going. Can we even use the infrastructure of old facilities that were pulp and paper mills? Could we make them more efficient if they're near us? And that's the kind of logic and thinking that went on. So as you can imagine, if I put cold water on liquid iron or liquid ferronickel, it'll be hot. What can you do with that hot water before I go to a cooling tower, which is the traditional method? So we
Hmm.
just started looking at, okay, could you help the pulp and paper mill, for example, heat up their solutions with the hot water before it goes to the cooling tower and goes back to being reused? Could you heat up buildings? And that was the logic to it. Can I heat up a greenhouse
Hmm.
and produce vegetables in the winter where no one thinks anything grows?
Hmm.
And that was how the logic started coming about. But without touching the ferronickel part, I don't know if we would have even considered that we could do this at a small capacity and be viable. Like pig iron, 50,000 tons ain't gonna cut it to be viable.
Yeah.
But ferronickel is, depending on, of course, on the percentage of your nickel.
And I want to talk about your presentation that you just did on Friday. It was pretty interesting because you talked a lot about the synergies in Quebec, and you and I have talked about that before. One of the main focus of that presentation was Baie Comeau Steel, and I think this kind of, or Baie Comeau Minerals, this kind of falls into the electric furnace and how that all comes together. So maybe elaborate on your presentation from Friday a little bit more.
Yeah, so I was asked to present the only element that fit the criteria there was titanium as one of the critical elements. So
Mm-hmm.
ilmenite was ticked off. But there are other critical elements and indirect activity going on in that same region where that mine would be operating, which is
Mm-hmm.
50 kilometers from the port. One of the angles to that is, of course, there's the St. George's activity with lithium.
Mm-hmm.
So there's St. George's activity with battery recycling, and you may now have put the link together. St. George has two properties north of Baie Comeau with nickel showings, which
Mm-hmm.
is ongoing. In a perfect world, that would be the source of nickel. And also in the perfect world, we've always discussed the byproduct of fertilizer with the lithium technology and with the battery recycling efforts.
Mm-hmm.
When you have a deposit of apatite, which is principally phosphate, you can start putting the links together that you might be only missing potassium at this point
Mm-hmm.
to have a high grade fertilizer. We've looked into that. That could easily be transported in, and we'd have the greenest solutions. So that's one aspect. The other aspect of it is, as you know, I alluded to titanium.
Mm-hmm.
And I started off by looking at how to fix a process called Magpie process at the time. And that led to the intellectual property that Fancamp is working on today, which is agglomeration, upgraded TiO2, and including the metals, titanium metal and titanium metal in 3D printing form is
Mm-hmm.
ongoing. Again, the coincidence on this is that even that one came from the efforts on iron making.
Yeah.
Not that it was done on purpose. It was, we have these finds, what do I do with them? And even in my case, working on both, it never occurred to me till I had both files next to each other. I was like,
Mm-hmm.
there's no way that the industry can't do this. And everybody that's an expert on this would tell you, we've tried and it's failed,
Mhm.
but they've never tried it like a steel maker. So when we redid it, it worked. So our partner developed the binder, we brought the methodology to make it work, and it's a carbon copy of what we do for NSGI steel, be it making ferronickel, be it for making pig iron. That was the first step. So we said that's worth patenting. Let's add that to it. Then we looked at properties that Fancamp had. That led to trying a resource that was in Havre Saint Pierre.
Mhm.
That worked, check. And it was a similar methodology to what I would do if I was running a pickle line in the steel industry. Then from there, well, are you interested in putting titanium metals into the portfolio?
Mhm.
So that got put in there too. And before I go another step further is that, the biggest impurity for titanium resources is iron. So it's not that surprising that you can come
No.
up with things when you can address the impurity of iron and turn it into a usable byproduct to become a low-cost producer. Now, in this particular case, not only are we addressing the iron, but coincidentally, the byproducts are also fertilizer. And coincidentally, Baie Comeau Minerals will have, again, everybody makes their own decisions, but when you're looking at resources and you want to reduce the operating costs, there's a reason why everybody looks for those synthetic rutiles or rutile sands for the chloride process, which is weathering and removing the iron naturally in the salt water. That's where the sands comes from. And then you have the synthetic rutiles where you're melting it and concentrating the TiO2 in the slag.
Mhm.
But when you're taking natural sands or resources of ilmenite, you try to get as close as possible to a 1-to-1 ratio of iron to titanium. Coincidentally, that's what Baie Comeau Minerals has. So there's a lot of links there
Mhm.
besides the fertilizer waste stream that would come out of this titanium metal product.
So you're an advisor at Fancamp, and when you mentioned it on Friday, I did a little digging. This is a company that's got an awful lot of properties, and right in your backyard. What particular properties or exploration projects that they're working on are of interest to you?
Yeah, so I haven't been privy to review the 90 properties that Fancamp has. And, as you can understand, 90 properties is a lot of properties for a junior.
Yeah.
And they vary from uh, pure like iron plays, like
Mhm.
mines. They have many what I call iron contaminated with titanium. We'll touch back on that. Then they have some that fall into the category of what I call smelter grade.
Mhm.
Then you have your typical IOCG, iron ore, copper, gold type properties. Again, I haven't reviewed all of them, but you can see where I'm going is that
Mhm.
but there's a natural fit sometimes for solving the iron problem or having a solution with the iron that's contaminated with titanium, give the titanium a zero value and move forward.
Mhm.
So we started looking at those things together. And I think there's some opportunities. On top of that, they have things that don't fall into that category, but even in Northern Ontario, they have claims with chrome, chromites, among others. So that's kind of, I don't approach projects like a geologist. I always look at the end and work my way back. Can I turn it into something useful? If the answer is yes, okay, do we actually have a resource? Is it even worth exploring?
Mhm.
There's the other way of doing it is I tell you I have 1 billion tons. All right, let's try to turn it into something. And then you start learning it. I guess if I was 20 years old, I might be doing that. But today, after the gray hair and all that and the mistakes, which is what teaches you,
Mhm.
um, you have a pretty good idea where to look at when you're developing properties. So I look at infrastructure, I look at logistics, I look at social acceptability. Where are my KPIs? Do I have them? Can I address them? And then I put weighting on properties to go after. In this particular case, let's put all that aside. You got 90 properties. Now it's just which one you want to work on for
That's it.
Fancamp. So in this case, I think the titanium angle has been completely forgotten. One is the agglomeration was done for the Magpie process fines. And today I can tell you that it's probably the solution for the whole chloride process in the industry. So when the particle is floating in the fluidized bed and it becomes too small, it fly out. So they have about 6 to 15%, depending on the feed, going to a bag house of this material that they just paid $700 a ton for. And the comment I'll make is, what if you could recover that and put it back in and eliminate that loss, and maybe even reduce their carbon needs? So the other part of it is TiO2 is titanium and oxygen. You got to tie up the oxygen, very much like in the steel industry, for the titanium to become a TiCl4 and then become the TiO2 again as the pigment for the industry in the chloride process. What if we can lower that carbon cost? So there was that, and that advanced, and it's I think it's a nice complement to the industry. That was the other thing. You're going to hear me say compliment often. Fancamp did a review internally. We discussed it. We can go in and become a disruptor, or we can go in and become a complement to the industry. This is what we've chosen to do. So then the next step was, can we make an upgraded TiO2 feedstock, successfully done, that can be used by the sulfate process or the chloride process? Check. And then from there, we're in the stages now of confirming the titanium metal technology with a greener route, and the byproducts can be recycled or converted to fertilizer. So it's a nice complement there. Again, just regular one element of the fertilizer industry, you're in a much lower price range. The blended high-end fertilizer that we're used to paying a premium for our grass is probably where you would like to be. And so that's going on in parallel. And then 3D printing is the next natural evolution. In all cases, it always takes a little more time than we expect to get lab organized. So that's why we've been somewhat quiet on the titanium metal, but we're progressing, and you'll hear more about that from Fancamp.
That's good. I was just going to ask you about that, but you answered my question, so that's good, because that's worth a lot of money when you get into the 3D printing or titanium and paint even, which I've seen a lot of references to as well.
That's an excellent point. So from a ilmenite, like let's say I'm talking about sands at 53% TiO2, that's in the $200 a ton range. You can get a premium to that, for example, like with a hard rock with a higher recovery, because it's unaltered, like Baie Comeau Minerals. Then you get into upgraded TiO2 feedstock, so be it a rutile sand or the synthetic rutile that comes from slag. That's in the $700 range today. And then you get to pigment, which will be a little under $3,000 a ton. Once you reach titanium metal, you're into the $30,000 a ton range. And if you get to 3D printing, it's in the $100,000 a ton range. So if you can come in with a new technology that lowers that and makes titanium more affordable, that'll increase the uses. So when we do internal financial evaluations, we use a more modest number like 50. But currently, I think the number is closer to $100,000 a ton. Well, what I see is anytime you have an opportunity to create positive cash flow, as a junior, you have to look at it.
Mhm.
You also have to determine who you are and what you are and where you're going to go with all of your 90 properties.
Mhm.
Um, so it's irrelevant if it's the SCO zinc that makes you money or the titanium that makes you money or both, but cash flow is king. And yeah, you've been around a lot of juniors. I think you know the struggles they go through raising money. So when you
Yep.
can be cash positive and continue your strategies, then you're in pretty good shape. And I think that's something that's overlooked with Fancamp today. So anytime I look at a project, you'll see that if it's IOCG, can you turn your iron problem into something, reduce those tailing costs, increase your revenues? If you look at the nickel industry, again, you'll see piles of black stuff in places, and you'll see piles of black stuff with copper. No one talks about the iron, but it's there, and it's the biggest contaminant of the non-ferrous industry.
Mhm.
So irrelevant if it's gypsum, iron, or something else, can you do something with it? And that's the right thought process.
So you alluded to something on Friday during your presentation about how the North Shore of Quebec is unique. Now, this area has been naturally recrystallized, and that makes a lot more efficiencies in your metallurgical process. Can you talk about how that comes into play for companies like Baie Comeau and Fancamp and even St. George with the Julie and Manicouagan deposits? Because I know that's a big part of what you're doing right now for all of these companies.
Yeah, so sometimes there's confusion between recrystallized and crystal growth, okay?
Mhm.
So crystal growth to me means just the grains got bigger and the chemistry stayed the same. Then there's the recrystallized, which means the crystals, in my definition, of course, change chemistry. So for example, in Baie Comeau Minerals, normally iron and titanium when they're together, and if you look all over the world, and that includes most of Quebec, you can grind it as much as you want. You can get down to 1 micron, but that titanium will still be attached to the iron in that wrong ratio. Okay, so you have a
Mhm.
lot of properties that are 15% TiO2, 18% TiO2, 10% TiO2, and the same amount of iron. So just to put it in perspective, if I use something like 10% or 11% TiO2 with 60% iron oxides, I have a 1 to 6 ratio of TiO2 to iron, and it's not going to separate. So my cost just went up because I'm trying
Mhm.
to go up to the TiO2, which is why the industry typically tries to get something closer to 1 to 1. In Baie Comeau Minerals, for example, by the chemistry, it looks like it's the same thing, except I get 90% of the TiO2 in pure ilmenite form. And the iron is actually free of TiO2, which is
Wow.
something not heard of before, right? So when you look at it that way, I've looked at some other properties north of there or not too far from there, and they're all different, but sometimes when a meteor hits, you might have some hidden gems. And I'm not doing this to say, there's a meteor not far from Manicouagan, for
But
example,
there
in
is.
St. George property, but there is. And, did it heat up the material and make the chemistry easier for mineral processing? We're going to find out soon. Okay. What I do know is normally the crystal structures, when you go from Newfoundland down to Quebec, tend to be a bit bigger. In that region, I'm by no means the geologist or the person who can tell you why, but
Mhm.
there might be some what I call crystal growth and due to having been reheated. Are there another anomalies near Baie Comeau that had what I call the real crystal growth, where the chemistries got separated and improved? We're working on some mineral processing north of Baie Comeau with Julie and shortly Manicouagan. I've looked at some rocks like Isokostuk, even though it didn't have the nicest grades. The rocks look very similar to Baie Comeau Minerals, where I saw splotches of black with other colors in them, which indicated to me recrystallized with a new chemistry. Again, that property is in other people's hands today, but irrelevant. That just says that there's some opportunities for that around the area.
So it seems like everything you're doing kind of centers around the North Shore of Quebec and Baie Comeau. And with a little bit of digging, you can find an MOU that was put in place a couple of years ago for the Baie Comeau Mineral Partnership. Now, this kind of, to me, just screams volumes to the synergies between St. George, EVSX, Baie Comeau Minerals, NSGI Technologies, Fancamp Exploration. I mean, you guys got a plant in Baie Comeau, and there's a lot of opportunity here. So is that something that's still in play right now? And is that something that we could see St. George become part of?
It's very much in play. It's grown. Okay, at the time we were talking about 800 million. Today we think we can do this for substantially less if we remove one of the iron making technologies that was proposed then, which was taking up 500 million. If you take a step back, we just discussed ferro nickel might be viable at 50,000 tons per year, and it is, okay, especially if you're at 30% nickel or better, and that's the expectation. The other part of it is again, you have a mine that has iron, the apatite, which is fertilizer, besides the ilmenite with the high grade TiO2 content. So if you take a step back and relook at it, the players that were there, if you repackage them and you start talking about battery recycling, lithium being added, it doesn't matter what the name is, okay? We can call it, at the time there was a lack of creativity. We had Baie Comeau Minerals, what do you want to call the partnership? Baie Comeau Minerals Partnership, okay, BCMP. But there's not a lot of creativity to it, but it still did the purpose. I look at it as more of a showcase for the North Shore and the rest of Canada, because you can take that model and go to other smaller regions with projects that look like they have nothing in common, and then you start putting the pieces together strategically, and all of a sudden you have something that becomes greener, more efficient, cost effective, and can move forward. So it's not a matter of you're first and everybody else loses. I still feel like we can copy this model in Sept-Îles, for example, which was where all the innovation started, and the thought process. I still feel it applies to the rest of Canada and internationally, to other parts of the world. So to me, this is a showcase to unlock value in Canada and Quebec.
Well, thanks, Enrico, for taking the time to talk to me about all the other things you got going on. I know we kind of covered a lot of bases there, but I think it helps paint a picture of the synergies that are really forming along the North Shore of Quebec. And my man, you're front and center in the middle of all of it with NSGI Steel Inc. So thanks so much again for joining me, and we'll talk real soon.
Thank you, Mike.